Okay, hey again. Welcome to part two. We're going to talk about APIs and all that API stuff. What's an API? An API is, I think it stands for Application Programming Interface, which is about as descriptive as API. Think of it this way. You're programming some sort of an application, sketch, whatever you want to call it, and there's some other application out there whose job it is to either collect information or control information, and you want to get that information. Instagram, right? Instagram is an app where people are sharing photographs and information for photographs, and you want to grab that information from Instagram, and you want a particular subset of the Instagram universe based on any number of things. It might be based on a username, it may be based on people near you geographically, or it may be based on, I have never really worked with the Instagram interface, but maybe there's some sorting by color where you just want the images that have predominantly blue in them. There may be some programming logic over at Instagram that we can leverage and then we can use for whatever it is that we want to build in our sketch. I would also be remiss if, we're talking about JSON today, and I'm doing it that way really selfishly to keep this thing somewhat simple. JavaScript object notation is, as you've seen in the first video, pretty convenient for us to use. It's easy, it works well with what we've been doing all semester, but there are data sets in other formats as well. There's XML, there are comma separated files, CSV files, tab delimited, whatever, web pages that you could scrape for information. Data isn't always put together in a nice, easy to use package. However, many APIs are put together in a fairly nice, easy to use package, and many of them use JSON. So know that if a data visualization career is ahead of you, or even for the final is ahead of you, you may find some data in other formats. P5 can handle those as well. There is a load table function, just like there is load JSON, and there are other, I think there's an XML handler as well, and you can do what we did with other file formats as well. But back to our API. So what is an API? The way that you get information from an API is that you access it via a URL, just like you were going to get an HTML page to load into your browser. You would dial into some URL, and I've got this, arbitrary URL, some API URL.com with some path to its data feed, and it usually goes something like this, where you have, a query string that we need to build ourselves to tell the API what information it is that we want, and it could be anything depending on what we're going to use. I'm going to use what seems to be universally like the favorite thing for beginner classes in API, and that's the open weather data map. And I'm going to do a visualization that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the temperature at different regions in the country, and I'm going to make a circle whose diameter or radius is proportional to what the temperature is, and that the color will change based on what the data is, and it will overlay some information about where in the country we got that data from. So, and we'll do that by typing in a zip code and hitting enter, and then it will do all of that for us. That's what we're going to build in the next lesson here. So think about that, and then think about this URL. So what we might do in this case, maybe we have some URL whose job it is to do something, give us some information based on where we are and what the time of day is and what date it is today. So the way that we would string together this URL is there would be a question mark usually, which sort of begins the query, and then we would put some key value pairs together again. This particular API might be looking for may have a location property that we can say, well, we're in the USA, and if we want to string this query together with another query, we would use an ampersand symbol to build our URL. So we might say our location is the USA and our time is, universal 1:20 in the afternoon universal time, and our date is 2017 March 27th 2017. We piece that all together. It wouldn't be obviously vertical, it would just be one long URL, and then we hit return, and then we'd get some sort of a JSON data back. That's exactly what we're going to do here. And then rather than typing it into the URL, we're going to set up our sketch such that we can accept some inputs. Maybe we have an input box for the location. If someone types USA or if they type France, they get some different piece of information. So we can use that to gather the data, bring it back to us, and then we can do whatever we want with it. If we want to draw some stuff on a sketch, or we want to send some stuff to the DOM like we did in the last video, we can do any of that. So that's what's in store. Okay, in order for us to get there, I tried to boil that down to something simple, but there are a few steps in the way of where we want to go. Let me just set the. Oh, this is not the right data. Sorry, I called up some wrong files here. So we are going to open these two, and this week what I have. Actually, maybe we'll just do the big reveal now, so you can see what it is we're going to build, and then hopefully have a better understanding of what it is that we're doing as we're doing it. Okay, I have this program that starts with an input value of 02138, which is Cambridge, Mass zip code, and based on that zip code, it's drawing a circle whose radius depends on the temperature right now in Cambridge. And it's outputting where it is that this zip code is from. So for example, what we can do is override that and let zip code challenge. How about Beverly Hills 90210? Okay, we'll hit submit. Okay, it says Beverly Hills. We have a red circle. It's warm in Beverly Hills, right? The circle is bigger. It's warm. Not the most sexy data visualization, but you could imagine if you had these as data points or little objects that you had roaming around your screen or doing some sort of a graph or plot, in each one of these data points that you gathered had its own diameter and label based on what it was that you were, querying. Let's go down to Fort Myers, Florida, which is a place I used to spend some time, and I'll submit that. Okay, Gateway is the name of the place in Fort Myers. Anyway, big circle, right? So it's warm in Florida today, I bet. It's not so warm here in Mattapoisett, which is where I live, Mattapoisett, Mass. Oh, it's above 40 degrees right now, evidently, because I set my threshold at, if it's above 40 degrees, don't show the chilly blue icon. But if you go to back to Cambridge, I guess it's not quite 40 up there. So, all right, that's what we're going to build. Let's do this. All right, so what I've done is I've created a couple of DOM elements within the HTML file itself. Now, you could create these in P5, but there's no real reason to. So I'm just doing it in HTML. Input your zip code, and then I have an input element, right, where I give it an ID of zip code, and I assign an initial value of 02138. I have a button with an ID of submit, which submits a new value. So the idea is that when we input something into our text box and we hit submit button, then our P5 sketch does something with it, right? So we're going to build all of that. Where are we getting this information from? Well, we're getting our information from a place called openweathermap.org. And what I think I'm going to do is take you over there now before we even talk about the code And what we'll need to do in order to use the data from Open Weather Map, we need to create an account that that allows us to identify ourselves, and they will, for free, give us access to this information, and they'll assign us an API key, right? So we're going to have this special password of sorts that's going to be unique to us. This one is unique to me, and it allows me to access the information on their API to a certain point. So if I built this little application that we'll use maybe 4 or 5 times an hour to get a couple of data points from, the data use is free. If we design some sort of an app that used weather data with 1 million hits an hour, then we are going to have to pay for that information. So knowing who we are is important for Open Weather Map, so that they can track the amount of bandwidth, the amount of data that we're using. Okay, so we'll get to the rest of this code in a minute, but let's go over to Open Weather Map and set up ourselves. So I'm going to go over to openweathermap.org. Right now, I'm not sure if I'm signed in, but what you're going to see is this, and it's essentially a service that gives forecast information. And you'll see that there are maps and all these things that you can use, but there's this API that's where we're going to spend our time. But before we can, let's see if we go to this API. To use it, basically this is saying to access the API, you need to sign up for an API key. Okay, so we click there. How to get an API key? Sign up to get an API key for your account page. You can either sign up the top of the page initially, or you can go through this convoluted path that I'm going through now. I'm actually already signed up, so I'm going to. Oh, it says I'm already signed in. Let me just log out. Okay, so I'm going to sign in as me with my username and password. I'm signed in. Okay, when you sign up for your account, you're going to be directed to a page that looks exactly like this, where you can input your username and optionally your full name if you want. But the second tab here where my mouse is, where it says API keys, are these strings of numbers. And when you sign up, you're immediately given a default key, which is absolutely fine for you to use. I created a new key just for DGMD E12, just so that I'd know that this is the key that I'm using for this class. So you could name your key. DGMD E27. Maybe I wanted to do something for Jen's class, and then generate another key. I'll generate a key, and it will give me yet another key. So anyway, I'm using this one here. Okay, so I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to now have access to the data. Well, let me show you what it would look like if we didn't have access to our API key. So let's see. We can go to current weather data, and you can see that there are all kinds of different data sets that we can play with here. There's some air pollution information or whatever. We'll just go to the current weather data, and I'm going to go to the documentation for it. This is how we learn how to build those query strings like I showed on the board. You can query by city name. You can query by an ID to a city, I guess, which I don't know what that means. You could query by your latitude and longitude, and by zip code, which is what we want to do. So if I grab this URL right here, notice it doesn't have an API key attached to it. So I'm just going to put this here, and I'm going to hit go, and it's going to say invalid API key. Please see Open Weather Map to get more info. Not a big deal. What I need to do is grab my API key right here, go back, and watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this by hand right now. I'm just going to put ampersand app ID, which happens to be the key property for our ID in Open Weather Map. You can find that in the documentation for this particular API, but I'm going to paste in my API ID now and hit go. And look at that. Instead of getting an error, we now get information for wherever 94040 is. Let's go back to Cambridge 02138. And we'll see we have different. We get, the lat lon for Cambridge. What it's doing, it's got, weather. It's got rain. So you could access weather.main and you'll get the word rain. You could go down here and, excuse me, in Maine, you see that there are a couple of properties, one of which of interest to us is temperature. And you'll say, wow, it's pretty hot in Cambridge right now. It's 276 degrees. That's like really hot. Well, that's Kelvin, right? So the standard units for open weather data are Kelvin. So I don't know how many, you might think in Kelvin, but being a lazy American, I think in Fahrenheit, right? So I'm going to use imperial units, and watch, I'm going to add that to my data string here. I'm going to say and units equals imperial, right, which is Fahrenheit. Hit go, and hopefully if we get down to temperature, okay, now it's only 37.69 degrees. So hopefully you can see how we're able to bend the information that we want and extract from this universe of weather data that Open Weather Map has. We only want one little tiny piece of pie related to, in this case, Cambridge, and we want it served in the fashion that we want to digest, in this case, imperial units. You might decide to go metric. I know that there are lots of folks in this class who probably think metrically, so you can say units equals metric, and sure enough, our temperature is now 3.16 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's what we're going to do. So this is the URL that we are going to bring into our sketch. We're going to kind of cut it into pieces just like I showed on the board, and we're going to plug in information for our own zip code so that we can jumpstart this to do exactly what we want for our sketch. Okay, back in our JavaScript sketch. I've commented a lot of this code, which you'll have over on GitHub. You'll see what we're doing. This URL that I just cut and paste is exactly what I have here in the comment section. Let me just toggle wrapping here. I think this is what. Okay. So we're going to take this URL and we're going to bust it apart so that we can piece it together with input from the user at the same time. Okay. So what I'm going to do is break it up into chunks. I'm going to assign, again, we're outside of setup here. You see here setup. We're up on the top of the sketch. These are global variables that I'm defining. I'm going to create a weather variable that's going to hold our data object. It's going to hold our JSON data, just like our manufacturer's object held the guitar stuff back in our last video. Okay, I am creating an API variable, global variable, that I'm cutting and pasting the first part of our URL into, and you'll see that it's inclusive of the question mark, which begins the query string, and then zip equals. Well, in Open Weather Map API, the key for zip code is zip, and then the value is whatever it is we want to put in. So what I'm going to do is paste in our own zip code later in a code. So for now, I'm just going to create a variable called zip, which will be taken from the user input. Okay. Then I'm going to paste behind the zip code. I'm going to paste our API key, and I'm going to do that inclusive of our ampersand symbol, which concatenates this query string, and the key property that Open Weather Map is looking for of app ID equals, and then our unique string for our API key. That's my unique key. You will have your own. And then finally, I want to make my units imperial, so I'm going to finish it with ampersand units equals, and then I'm typing in imperial. So what we'll do later in the sketch is I'm going to take all of these variables and I'm just going to concatenate them together to make one big string, and then I'm going to grab that data from that URL. All right. Okay, so on to the logic that follows. For this sketch, we are using a canvas because that's how I'm going to draw out the ellipses size and color and the name of the data point. So I create this canvas that's 300 pixels square, and I'm going to use some of our DOM tricks from the past couple of weeks, and I'm going to create a variable called button, and I'm going to select that button on our HTML page that had the ID of submit, if you recall. Right, so back here, this button is what I'm selecting, and I'm putting it in our variable button. And then I'm assigning to this button a element specific event. Right, so this isn't a global mouse pressed anywhere on the page, but you have to press the mouse, you have to press the button to get it to do something. And what I'm doing here is I'm assigning it a callback function. Again, you can refer back to our DOM discussions if this is a little bit unfamiliar to you. We can go back and refresh that. But if you recall, if we give our event a function name inside the parameters, it will run that function when the event happens. Okay, so let's just disregard this for now, but we'll go in to see what it is that our getTemp function does. I created this function myself to get the temperature of the, and I didn't finish my thought here, the location of interest based on zip, right? Based on zip code. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the element on our page with the ID of zip code, and I'm going to get its value, and I'm going to assign that to our global zip variable, right? Just to remind you, I'm back in my HTML file now. Here's our input field where I say input your zip code and then input field with an ID of zip code. So whatever's in this input field is what's going to be assigned to zip. And you can see that I pre-populated that value with 02138. So I kind of pre-baked in the first value for the sketch, which allows me to then go and uncomment this page back in setup, is that this getTemp call in setup runs this temperature function the first time over before any input is put in from the user. It gets the first value from the page itself, which I pre-baked Cambridge into there. Okay, so that's what allows me to call getTemp without getting an error, because I actually do have a value for zip code already in there. Now, if I didn't pre-populate with a value for zip code, we'd get an error here saying this is undefined and we can't work with it. Okay, that's just a little bit of an aside, but that's just some trickery that you can use to set up your own sketches if you're doing something similar to what we're doing here. Okay, moving right along. Here's the big ta-da moment, and what I'm doing is we're going to piece together our URL, a variable that we're calling URL, from our API, which is this this URL segment up at the top, plus our zip code, which is, as we know, whatever's coming in off the page, plus our API key, which is my secret code, plus whatever units it is that I want to be delivering this information. And in my case, it's imperial, right? And that doesn't need to exist. So what we'll do at this point, we have a URL of interest, right? So we have this URL that we've pieced together. And if we wanted to, a lot of times some people are still having some troubles with variable information and not understanding why it is that their sketch isn't working as expected. And then I'll ask them, well, what's the value of your variable? And they'll say, well, I don't know. Well, console log it. That's what you need to do. So if you console log, in this case, I'm going to console log my URL. Let's just run this again. I saved it. I'll go back to my sketch. Where are we? Okay. I'm going to run the sketch again. I'm going to open the console, and you'll see here is my URL, console logged, right? If I click on that URL, I'm actually going to pop open the data that we're pinging with our file. So that's what you guys should be doing. If for some reason you're like, why isn't my data loading? Well, first thing you might want to do is check to make sure your URL is what is put together the way that it should be. For example, let's break it, right? So instead, I'm going to take out my API key. Okay, I'm going to save it, and the sketch isn't going to work. See, sketch doesn't work anymore, and then we get some sort of error that says unauthorized. Well, it's unauthorized. If we click through, whoops, I don't know why it did that. Anyway, the console says it's unauthorized. I don't know why. Oh, it should be able to go over to the link. Open the link in the new tab. Invalid key, right? So we created this error falsely, but if you were running into some sort of a hiccup, that's how you troubleshoot in an ongoing fashion. All right. So thankfully, our URL was put together okay, and we were able to get some data from it. How am I getting this data? Well, this time you'll notice that that we don't have this global preload function like we did in the last sketch that we did. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm calling the old load JSON function that we used in the last video. I'm dumping it the URL of interest, and then I'm adding a second parameter to our load JSON, which is a callback parameter. And this is completely similar to what we did with our callbacks in our DOM manipulation video. It works the exact same way. So what am I doing in got data? Well, I'm waiting, and it says, okay, load JSON from the URL. I'm doing that. Okay, I finally loaded all that information. All right, I've got all that information. Then run got data once you've done that. Okay, it goes over here to got data. Got data is a very simple function, but it's a little bit confusing, and I want you to see what's going on here. You'll notice that I didn't even include a parameter for got data. I just said call got data. Well, one of the things that you get for free with load JSON or with load table or any of these functions is that once it does what you asked it to do, it's got its own self. It's got like a this type of it's got its own data that it's now going to serve to you. So what we can do is we can create this parameter in our function got data. We can call it data. We can call it my data. We can name it whatever we want. And I'll just call it my data just so you don't think it's some sort of a reserved word. And what I'm doing here in this one line of code is if you remember back up at the top, I had this variable that I created to hold our weather object, just like our guitar manufacturer's object. All I'm doing is saying, okay, give me all that data and assign it to my weather object. And let's do some stuff with it, right? So now I have this object that's called weather that has, let's go back. Let me see. I'm going to shrink this to half the page. Bear with me for a second here. I'm going to put this on the right-hand side of the page. I'm going to go back to our data here so that we see what's going on. Okay, here I am, and we've got my weather data now, right? So in line 49. Now we're going to go into the draw function for our sketch. And I'm going to use this weather data and use dot notation to get at pieces of it, just like I did in the previous video. All right, so in our draw function, the first thing I'm doing is I'm just creating a arbitrary gray background just because. And look at this call. So what I've got here is a call to a condition. I have a conditional I've set up called if weather. I was like, well, what does that mean? If weather. So think about what's happening here. We've got this whole callback thing going on, right? And until this load.json function is complete and we have the information that we've grabbed from that URL, well, the URL doesn't have any data, right? There's no data for got data. Therefore, there's no weather information. Therefore, weather is undefined, and we can read this conditional. It says if weather is undefined, undefined returns false. If something is undefined, it returns false. If something has a value, it returns true. So this is a way that we can very elegantly just say if weather, and that all that means is, hey, if we've got something in our weather variable, if our weather object has stuff in it, then let's use the stuff. Otherwise, we probably haven't completed our JSON loading yet asynchronously. If we had taken this out, well, let me just make sure everything is, I'm going to kill the console here for a second. Okay, right, everything's working. Let me get rid of this if weather for a second. And I'm going to get rid of its corresponding, I believe this is its corresponding closing brace. I'm going to do this and it's going to break. And, oh, actually, I'm going to save the file. Then I'm going to refresh. And it doesn't break. Why doesn't it break? I don't know why it didn't break, but it should break. Possibly it's just loading in time quickly enough before the sketch even gets going. But trust me. Oh, there you go. Okay, it broke. Okay, so now it's saying uncaught error cannot read property main of undefined. Well, what is main? I'm trying to do some stuff with weather.main in my draw function, and weather is undefined. So I can't read the property main of undefined. And there you go. It threw up on itself, right? Just like I promised it would. So let's put that back. That conditional is important. Again, if we got data, let's do stuff with it. Otherwise, let's not make any calls to that data that we don't have yet. All right? That's how you can think of this logically. I'll save that, and hopefully when I refresh now, okay, things are back as they should be. All right, so what exactly are we doing with this data? So if weather, okay, we have weather data. What are we going to do with it? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to draw an ellipse based on the temperature, right? And I want the temperature to look bigger than it typically would with diameter. So you probably have seen this in the reference because we've drawn a bazillion ellipses. But in case you haven't, if you wanted to override the ellipse mode such that rather than drawing an ellipse where you say, you know, my temp would be the diameter, you could have a value here be the radius instead. So it would essentially make the ellipse twice as big. Right? That's all that this does. This has nothing to do with the API. Okay, here's the first thing that does have something to do with the API. And I'm creating a variable, I'm calling it myTemp, and I'm assigning it the value of our weather object, right, which was our data dump, and then I'm going to drill down to the main section and then the temp within that. So how did I figure out where that comes from? I had to go look at my API data, and you'll see here, here's our object. I called the object weather. Actually, it has its own property called weather. I don't want that to confuse you, but here's the weather object, and we're going into main, right? And within main has an object with some properties, one of which is temp, and the temp is 3.16 Celsius. Recall that in this particular sketch I'm drawing, I think the units are in metric. Come on, I don't know why it's not. So if you just change that to imperial, just so that there's continuity here. Close down our weather. Main.temp is now 37.69. So I'm going to be taking that value of 37.69 and I'm dumping it into my temp. Okay? And we're calling Cambridge right now, and it says, then I just do a little conditional to decide what color I'm going to draw my circle. And I say if the temperature is equal to or greater than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm going to fill it with red. Else I'll fill it with blue. And then, well, what am I going to fill? Well, let's draw an ellipse. I'm going to draw an ellipse in the middle of the screen, width divided by 2, height divided by 2, with a radius of my temp. Okay? That's how we use this data in our sketch. And on top of that, now I'm going to change the fill color to white so that I can put some text on top of my ellipse. So text align, center, center. What that does is it defaults, just like you think it would, vertically and horizontally centering at the coordinates that I give it. And what I'm doing is I'm taking now weather.name, and we can see here's our weather object, and I'm going to .name, which is down here, Cambridge, right? So I'm grabbing this now. And I'm taking that string and I'm putting it in the middle of the canvas. That is it. So now save this up, go back to our page, and lo and behold, everything works as it should. Okay, so that is it. That is a really quick, probably not so quick. This probably has gone on for at least a half an hour. I don't know how long the video has gone, but there are several steps involved in getting information from an API. Now, I should also mention to you that this weather data is just one API. It's pretty simple to use. It's pretty well documented, and I would suggest that you probably play with this one first to get your feet wet. I like that it forces you to use an API key, but not all APIs force you to use a key. So with that, I also included in the course reference, where did I put it? If we go back to our Canvas page, and I'll go to the modules for week 10. Down here in week 10, you'll see that I also have, in addition to that list of data files, here's the link to the Open Weather Map API, which is a good place to start. And then I have this other list of a whole bunch of other data streams that you can mess around with. So going to these, I found this list of a whole bunch of things. So, animals, environmental data, health data, math, music, news, whatever. So, I don't know, go to news, and you'll see, New York Times has their API. It provides news. You do need an API key. It's served via HTTPS. Let's go there, and you can get your key here, and you can be onto doing some stuff with New York Times news information. I'll show you one other thing that I built. I didn't build this one in P5JS. P5JS didn't exist yet, but I'm thinking of the WordNick API. I don't know if this sketch even exists. Does it? I don't even know if this thing's going to work. Okay. Oh, you shouldn't be seeing that. Okay. This game, I used the WordNick API, which is a dictionary API. And what I did, this was several years ago. This code doesn't look as pretty as it should. So it's fetching a word, cried, and now you have to start typing words that rhyme with cried, right? So it's looking for rhymes on time. So lied, yes, that worked. Tried, fried, is that going to work? No. How do you spell fried? That's not how you spell fried. Maybe that's fired, didn't work. I'll spell it twice. Fried, that's how you spell fried. Banana. That doesn't work. Banana doesn't rhyme with cried. So, time 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I built this in for E15. I used PHP for this. But anyway, you could do a sketch where you're doing some information by querying an API and then using it for a game of some sort. This isn't a fantastic example. It's just an example I had on the top of my head that is now a few years old. But again, I think if you go to this link that I sent to you, I think if you look at I think WordNick's probably in here somewhere. I don't know. Let me just. I bet it is. I don't know what it's under. WordNick dictionary data, and it's under data access. So that's another very friendly API that you could use if you're interested in doing some stuff with language type fun. There's all kinds of cool things. They have this rhyming feature, which I thought was pretty fun. Okay, so that is probably more information than you need on APIs, especially if you're not doing an API for your final. But with that said, I hope that you enjoyed this, this hour or so of digging into what we can do with APIs. And if you are interested in digging deeper, this is the time where you should go and look at the Dan Schiffman videos. I think you'll find that my code examples are pretty well dovetailed with his, so that if you continue on to those, you should have a good framework. I think we're doing some very similar things. So with that, I look forward to your questions in the forum, and otherwise we will see you next week, where we start to, I think next week is we start to play around with images, which is really fun. So talk to you then.